Please, Bruce, here with us. Bueno, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Es un verdadero gusto contar con la presencia del maestro Bruce Elder en esta clase magistral que, bueno, además de la proyección, tenemos la oportunidad de conversar de primera voz con una de las voces que de alguna manera recuperan el sentido del cine en su esencia original, que es esta provocación a través de la imagen y el sonido, de reflexión, sin necesariamente ilustrar. El trabajo de Bruce Elder está mucho más cerca de esa experiencia que uno tiene en el cine cuando ocurre como por acá arriba, no ocurre necesariamente en lo que se ilustra en la pantalla. Y ese ejercicio de la creación cinematográfica es una que nos motiva a eso, a la reflexión, a la búsqueda del sentido o a la pérdida del sentido de la realización del cine desde sus aspectos más convencionales hasta los más desafiantes, y pensamos que es una gran oportunidad para estar en contacto con la obra del maestro Bruce Elder, a quien le pido un fuerte aplauso, por favor. Thank you. I can explain a short version of what I said, but it was very nice. Pues hablando de provocaciones, una de las personas que impulsaron la actividad, Sophie y Manuel, su persistencia un poco enloquecedora, sobre todo por ellos mismos estar en la búsqueda de un cine que les haga eco. Así que, chicos, comenten por favor lo que les representa a ustedes esta actividad.
Gracias, Alfredo. Hicimos un breve texto introductorio. Bruce, Kathy, la esposa de Bruce, que está ahí, Sofía y yo les queremos agradecer que estén a todos aquí. Bruce Elder es uno de los cineastas experimentales más importantes de Norteamérica. Su obra se compone de más de 35 películas filmadas desde 1975 y más de 70 horas de material. Paralelamente, Bruce ha desarrollado una amplia carrera de docencia cinematográfica y también ha escrito 7 libros e innumerables artículos. Su película Lamentations, A Monument to the Dead World, es una obra de 7 horas y media. Fue seleccionada por el Festival Internacional de Cine de Toronto como una de las 150 mejores películas de la historia de Canadá, lista que incluye a cineastas como Norman McLaren, como Michael Snow, Alan King, Guy Madan, Jack Chambers, Lisa Steele, David Cronenberg, Javier Dolan, entre otros. Ha expuesto su cine a lo largo y ancho del planeta y en 2007 ganó el Governor's General Award in Visual Media and Arts, que es el galardón con más prestigio de Canadá en su campo, y es miembro de la Royal Society de Canadá. Personalmente, Sofía y yo esperamos que esta clase magistral y la retrospectiva en la Cineteca ayude a abrir nuevos panoramas en el quehacer cinematográfico de nuestro país. Esperamos que estas películas ayuden a despertar la conciencia de quienes las vean y nos encaminen a encontrar senderos que conduzcan a mejores maneras, menos dogmáticas, menos institucionales, menos decimonónicas y menos rígidas de hacer cine, y que en su lugar las formas libres, personales, independientes e íntimas invadan nuestros ojos, mentes, corazones y cámaras, al menos por un momento. Los nuevos problemas exigen nuevas respuestas, y para que los viejos problemas mueran, las viejas respuestas se deben ir con ellos. Los queremos invitar también a las funciones de la Cineteca. Hay una función diario a las 7:15 de mañana hasta el domingo, y una clausura en el IFAL, el Instituto Francés de Latinoamérica, el 2 de marzo. Y los dejamos con Bruce.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm very sorry that I don't speak Spanish. My family was absolutely adept at language. All of my brothers and sisters and father spoke several languages. I was the black sheep in the family and decided that I wasn't going to learn language. languages, I would study mathematics and engineering and science, and it's left me that gesture has left me impoverished, I must say. I do wish that I spoke Spanish and that we could have this conversation in Spanish. I'm sorry. The film that we're looking at today is Eros and Wonder. My films belong to two large cycles. The first was titled The Book of All the Dead. I worked on it from 1975 until about 1995. Then I embarked on a second series of films, The Book of Praise. And I hope that each film stands up independently, that one can look at Eros and Wonder by itself, and that one can have I hope, moving experience from it, even though it is excised from the larger cycle, which gives it, I hope, an additional layer, or gives it additional layers of meaning. The film involves a variety of forms. It began, as many of my films do, with a automatic poem, a kind of surrealist poem, a poem that I wrote at the end of one school year when I was finally free from my obligations to classes and had a few days that I could devote to nothing but my creative work. And I sat down and wrote an automatic poem, a poem written really almost as fast as I can type. That is one element of the film. In addition, there is imagery. This imagery is processed by hand in many cases, but it is also processed through programs that I wrote. I had by this time developed some skills in computer programming and programming for image processing, and wrote a whole series of algorithms for processing the imagery that I had shot. Most of the imagery comes from a trip that I took through Europe, largely France and Germany, and I hope involves or elicits a sense of a child's wonder at a fairy tale land of his childhood. I grew up in a family where there was a lot of books of German poetry and German picture books and German fairy tale books. And Germany was, for me, very much a fairy tale country. And so this is, I hope, a work that elicits some of that child's sense of wonder at encountering a fairy tale world, but also the way that that world is being transformed by technological developments, by political developments, and so on. You can hear at times little strains of music playing in the background, classical music, and those pieces of music that you hear in the background of the soundtrack are always pieces of music that were composed in the town that we're going through at the time, the town that you're seeing on the images. So again, it's a recollection, if you will, of a bygone world, a world that is no longer with us, a world that has escaped. Photography is always, of course, an art that is capturing a world that is on the wing and is fleeting. By the time we look at the photograph, what we photograph no longer exists. Photographs are always, in my view, about death, about absence, about the bygone, about the fleeting, and about what could no longer be recovered. And of course, in some sense, my childhood fantasies of what this fairy tale world was like wasn't matched in the reality that I was photographing. I like to use many, many competing elements at the same time. I refer to this as a technique of textual excess. There is always more at any given moment of the film, more than you can take in at any given time. At any given moment, you might be pulled to listen to the poem that is being read. Or you might be, I hope, sometimes fascinated by the quality of the image and the image processing. You might be interested, you might be paying attention to the kinds of montage that I'm using. You might be paying attention to the way that the chemical processing, and I might say I consider the film as made at the time of transition between analog cinema and digital cinema. So the hand processing is all about chemistry, the old film, the alchemical film, the film that you dunked in tanks and developed, and the new film, which is made with electricity. And the theme of electricity is something that interests me. But this is a film in between the made at the time of the transition from analog to digital cinema, and I've tried to make it a film that belongs to that moment in history. But to get back to the point, I hope that sometimes you'll want to be paying attention to how the chemistry is transforming the imagery, for I think that filmmaking is all about transformation. Transform is really a slogan of mine. How the chemistry transforms the imagery, how the digital image processing transforms the imagery. The art that I think of as the supreme art is really music. And I've strived to create a work with musical form. And I hope that you'll just be carried along by the film in the same way one is carried away by a piece of music. And that you won't be struggling with it saying, what did that, I missed, I was paying attention to something else and I didn't catch what the poem was saying. Or I missed what that image was. I was listening to the poem and I didn't see the image. Don't fight with the film that way. Follow your pleasure. Attend to what interests you. If it's the image at this moment, attend to it. If it's the poem, attend to it. If it's the music, attend to it. And that overall, you will be carried away by the film in the same way that you are by a piece of music. That's my hope. You'll let me know afterwards whether you think that I achieved that goal. Thank you so much for coming. Okay, so I wanted to start out talking about how it was that I came to cinema, what it was that brought me to the cinema, and the influences on me that led me to try and create new film forms. And let me say that I try in every work that I make to take on some sort of challenge which I consider to be an extreme challenge. A challenge that will leave me feeling as I am making it, and I hope you, as you are looking at it, is he going to be able to pull this off? Is he going to be able to take this set of images, putting it through certain processes, making a noisy industrial soundtrack? Can he sustain this for a period of time and bring it all together as a whole in the end? It's always seemed to me a very strange ambition to want to reproduce forms that already exist, varying them in some slight way, changing a character to some sort of an eccentric or something of that sort, to try and create films with a kind of conflict and resolution that has been done so often. I like to try and give myself the challenge of working in extreme forms that leave me feeling as I'm making it, can I pull this off? Can I make a satisfying, powerful work? Can I pull all this together to create a real resolution? And I must say that the process of making the work is one of extreme exhilaration and extreme despondency, when I'm feeling I'm breaking through and beginning to pull things together and it seems to fall apart or resist me. And it's a real difficult battle to try and create a form from nothing, trying to start from scratch. This idea of starting from scratch is in fact balanced by another idea that I have, and we'll talk about that anon. But right now I want to say this sense of trying to build a form from scratch, to try and do something that no one has ever done before, a challenge that is extreme. And it's risky, of course. If you fail, you fail ridiculously. It's easy to make a film that's competent in a conventional form, that's competently made. If it fails, the failure is slight. There's still something of interest, something of one can recognize the skills in the making, to start and try and create a form from scratch, to do something that nobody has done before, really does run the risk of failing miserably, failing ridiculously. Okay, so I wanted to say that about a motivation for my work. How I came to the cinema. I was a philosophy student at the University of Toronto. I was a pretty successful philosophy student at the University of Toronto. But when I was about to embark on my doctoral studies, the department convened all of the graduate students. Universities were a much smaller business at that time. Fewer people attended university. Graduate studies was relatively rare. And it was quite possible for a university of the rank of the University of Toronto, it really is a good university, of the rank of the University of Toronto, to be in touch with departments across the continent, and to know how many graduate students there were in each department, and to know how many faculty members would be retiring in the next few years, how many, what the rate of how many faculty would be likely to decide that teaching was no longer something that they wanted to do, and they could choose a career that would pay somewhat better. They could compile all those statistics. They called the students, the graduate students in, and they had, in those days, there used to be kinds of tripods, rather like easels that painters paint on with big sheets of paper, and they prepare the presentation not on PowerPoint in those days, but on sheets of paper that they'd flip, and they presented all of the gloomy statistics for us. And basically the message was, there's almost no chance that any of you will ever have an academic job. There are going to be so few retirements in the next few years. Universities expanded for the baby boom. So they hired new faculty. That process was over. The baby boom was through the universities. There wouldn't be, in fact, the student population would contract. There's no chance that they told us that any of you will be able to find a university position. Well, that was difficult for me. And my family didn't have a lot of money, so I wasn't the sort of student that could just say, well, it's okay if I don't. I can spend 7-8 years writing a dissertation and I won't be able to get a job that will depend on that dissertation. It just didn't seem it seemed an impossible situation for me. I was, moreover, at the time already writing and publishing poetry. Poetry and music are my first great loves in the arts. And so I thought that I would resolve to embark on becoming a poet. Well, there's no money in poetry either. That wasn't a way that I could support myself. And so I began to think, what could I possibly do that would to support my poetry? And I thought for a period of time about being a short order cook. Do you know this expression? At fast food restaurants, there'll be a guy at the grill that will flip the burgers or fry the eggs or prepare the hash or whatever. I thought, maybe I can become a short order cook. But that seemed a rather difficult way to make a living. Then I thought, well, perhaps I can learn to make educational movies. At the time, there was an industry of a significant size in making and educational movies. And it could start with simple movies like how to work a bandsaw or how to use a router. And over time, it might evolve into scientific documentaries, such as, by the way, Stan Brakhage sometimes did. So that seemed plausible, a good way to go. Still in the field of education, I guess the apple never falls very far from the tree. And but I realized there was a problem, and that was I didn't know anything about photography, and I didn't know anything about filmmaking. So while I was still a graduate student at the University of Toronto, I enrolled in a filmmaking class and started to try and learn filmmaking. And then, while I was enrolled in this class, I heard that Ryerson was opening up a one-year post-diploma program for Ryerson's own graduates. Ryerson was a 3-year college at the time, or for university graduates. And I thought, that's what I'll do. I'll enroll at Ryerson for a year and become a good craftsperson. Well, I did that, and it turned out that there was a reason why our department was offering a post-diploma program, an advanced diploma as they called it, and that was they were planning to open a 4-year program in film that would culminate in a degree. Not exactly the same kind of degree as universities offered, but would still be letters after your name and so on. They knew that if they had to offer a 4-year program, that they would have to offer courses in film studies. And at the time, there were not universities that were teaching film studies. Where do you find someone to teach film studies? Well, I was around, and I had written poetry, and I had published criticism, and I had some background in aesthetics and so on. And they suggested that I stay behind, take a job as a teaching, setting up the courses in film history and film theory, film criticism, and the like. Well, I really didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be a teacher. I had decided by this point, but I thought, until I have my business set up, until it's bringing in money, it would probably be a good idea to take the job. So I did. And then in the spring, I began teaching in the fall. In the spring before the first semester I was to teach, I was leafing through a filmmaker's newsletter. And there was a advertisement for courses, graduate courses in film studies in New England. And I looked at the names of the people that were teaching there. Diane Arbus had taught the previous year. She was listed on the agenda. Ricky Leacock, who is one of the world's great one of the greatest documentarians in history, was teaching documentary. A fellow by the name of Jerry O'Grady, whom I didn't know, was teaching a course, teaching film studies. And a good scriptwriter, George Bluestone, was teaching a class on script writing. So I thought, I know what I'm going to do. Kathy and I will go down to and enroll in this graduate program. Kathy will take the course in teaching film studies. And so I can get some ideas about what others were doing. And I'll take the course in script writing, something as a creative writer that might be possible for me to teach, and then I'll get some kind of a grounding. Seemed like a good idea at the time, and in fact, the Summer Institute in Film Studies that first year transformed my life. It transformed it. There were a number of features of that institute that absolutely changed my mind on everything. The first was that Jerry O'Grady, who was teaching the course and teaching film studies, was an extraordinary thinker on film. Kathy came back after the first class she had attended, and she told the story. Well, you know, this guy spends half his life up in the air. He has a job teaching film studies at University of Houston. University of Texas at Rice University. And he also teaches in public schools and high schools in Houston. He teaches at Columbia. He teaches at New York University. And his basic appointment is at Buffalo. And I was very, very skeptical, but went to hear Jerry O'Grady talking, and the kind of analysis that he gave of films was just a model for me. He also was deeply, deeply influenced by the work of Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan's ideas about teaching and the university. McLuhan believed, as I believe, as I think most reasonable people believe, the university of the 1800s is now certainly, and even then was all over, that new students are learning in new ways. They're wired differently. They think differently, and this is a topic I want to come back to. They're wired differently. They think differently, and we need new ways of teaching that can speak to students who are put together in different ways than people of my generation were, and certainly than people of the late 1800s, when universities became, when the modern research university was being founded. So that was one thing that was deeply important to me, and in fact helped shape my ideas of what a good film education would be. The second important event, though, was I had heard through the friends that I made as soon as I got to the Summer Institute. They were there taking classes with a filmmaker, talking him up extremely highly. They did at this institute something that, in my view, should be done in every film school and in every art school everywhere in the world. And that was, in the first place, teaching was largely by artists, active artists, and secondly, the artists would have to, the teachers, present their work to the entire student body. Each evening was given over to one person, Ricky Leacock, Bruce Bailey, and a number of people who were there. Ed Emshwiller, a filmmaker of terrific importance to me. Shirley Clark, who was another teacher there. Each person, each teacher presented basically a 3 or 4 hour long session on their work. Well, the second night, I went to the faculty member's presentation, and he presented Window, Water, Baby Moving, Western History, Door, and a number of other films. I'm speaking, of course, of Stan Brakhage. I saw the work of Stan Brakhage for the first time. And I said to myself at that moment, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. This is the new poetry. The poetry that I've been doing is the poetry for people from the 1920s, 1930s. I want to make poetry for the new world that is emerging out of the new technology, the electric technology that Marshall McLuhan kept talking about, that this was really electric poetry, and that was what I wanted to give my life to. Well, of course, I had taken the job at Ryerson to help on a temporary basis, hoping that I could set up a business and support myself as a poet. Now I felt that the Holy Spirit had somehow asked me to make a very different kind of poetry, a poetry with 16 millimeter film. I understand that you people work with 16 millimeter film. You know what it costs. And it was never cheap. It was never cheap. Okay, if I wanted to make electric poems with this celluloid film, well, it was going to cost me even the proposition of trying to make a living from this was completely untenable. The audience is negligible. Hardly any people go and see this kind of film. The costs are very high. There's only one thing that I can do, and that's stay at Ryerson and make a go of it. In the end, I might say, I came to love teaching very much. I enjoy presenting work to students and talking about new forms in film and try and encourage them to take risks and to try new forms in film. So that became the way that I supported myself for years. Okay. I then, after attending that first evening, began to sneak into Brackage's classes. I wasn't enrolled in them, but I just decided that it was something that I absolutely had to do. And in fact, Jerry O'Grady, partly out of his McLuhanist ideas about education, did encourage people to cross boundaries, to attend classes that they weren't involved in, and so on. Okay. And so Brackage at the time was teaching the songs. The songs are a series of 38 millimeter films. Films that he made under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Stan had been working in advertising and in documentary film for several years to support his work as an artist. And from the time he was really quite young, there were a significant number of screening centers and universities, not great, but a substantial number, who would either hire his films or hire him to come and present his films. Some of you have, I don't know whether it's the same commercial as shown here. Have any of you seen the commercial for Downy liquid detergent? And there's a bottle that falls very, very, very slowly onto a hamper of a laundry hamper filled with clothes. That's been remade over and over and over and over again. But the guy who originated that film that advertisement with Stan Brakhage. So if you've seen that, you've seen at least a remake of a remake of a remake of a remake of one of Stan Brakhage's commercials. But it got to be more... He wasn't making much of a living from it. The children were often hungry. He tells the story of one time the American Film Institute people had Russian visitors to America to visit American filmmakers, and Brakhage was one person on the list. And so a convoy of limousines drove up the mountainside in Colorado where Brakhage lived with a number of Russian film directors in the convoy. And they were going to meet Stan Brakhage. He had nothing whatsoever in his house. He had to run off and beg a neighbor living some distance from him to give them some sugar so that he could at least make a cup of tea for these Russians who were visiting, doing very, 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 they were being treated very, very well. Okay, so he was living a very difficult life, and Jonas Mekas told him that if he were to come to New York, Jonas could get him any number of documentary jobs, that he was also involved in screening documentaries. He knew a lot of people in the documentary industry, that if Stan would come to New York, that he could get documentary jobs. So he packed up his truck full with his camera equipment, with his tripod. He did sometimes use one, with his tripod, with his light meter, with his set of lenses and so on, and drove from Colorado to New York City and went to the Filmmakers Co-op, which was then on Lexington Avenue. Not the most wealthy area of New York City, and went in to talk to the people at the co-op. And he came out, and his camera equipment was stolen. He no longer had a way to make films. Not only did he not have the equipment that he needed to make documentaries to feed the kids, he didn't even have a way to go on making his own work. So, in despair, he got in the truck and drove back to Colorado. And then he went down he lived in Rollinsville, which was 50 kilometers perhaps. Godforsaken area. Cold, 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 and just lived in a 1890s log cabin in very straitened circumstances. If any of you ever get a chance to see Tortured Dust, that's the log cabin that he lived in for years and years. This is a film that is about the marriage. He had been married to Jane Brakhage, for some decades. This was their household that they had shared for all this time and raised a family in, raised 5 children in this, and they began to have children. Sometimes The grandchildren would come and live with them too, in very confined circumstances. And the marriage is breaking up. The children are moving away. It's one of the most harrowing films I've ever seen in my life, and I really recommend it. If you ever get a chance to see Tortured Dust, watch it. At the end of the film, you will just sit devastated. You'll have to pick up and try and assemble the pieces that you will have been broken into in the course of watching that harrowing film. Anyway, they lived in Rollinsville, or just outside of Rollinsville, and Stan got in the truck and came down to the bank to ask for a loan so that he could buy new camera equipment. Stan was always in very frail health, but he was a big fellow. He was really tall. I don't know, 6'1", 6'2", is that right? Do you agree, or is that an exaggeration? He was tall, and moreover, he lived up in the mountains of Colorado, and had become barrel-chested. Chest expands so that, when the air is rare, the lungs can be larger, and you can take in more. This is necessary to draw in the oxygen from enough oxygen to sustain you in this rarefied atmosphere. And he really looked like a big, healthy, tough guy. In fact, one time, that time's gone for us, but one of my hobbies used to be wine, and there was a wonderful wine store in Boulder, and it just didn't look like a wine store. It had a great collection of foreign wines, and I'd always try and pick something up and bring it home. But it just didn't look like a wine store. And so then Brackage told me we went together to buy a bottle of wine, and Brackage said, this used to be the produce. This was a grocery store, and over there was the produce. And one day, and he had grown his hair long. You see it in Dog Star Man, those of you who have seen it. He grew his hair long. And one time he was in the grocery store, in the produce section, with this long hair. And a man came up to him and he said, do you want to make a lot of money? And so he said, yes, of course, I'd like to make a lot of money, but what do I have to do? You'd be a great wrestler, and I could make a really big star from you as a wrestler. And when you saw this bulky, this big, barrel-chested, large guy, really quite tall, you could imagine why he would think that Brackage would make a really good wrestler. He decided, however, that it wasn't for him and let it go. Anyway, so this fellow goes to the bank to ask for a loan, and he has no job, so of course the bank manager starts to tell him, no, of course I can't give you a loan. You have no collateral. You have a lousy log cabin up in a godforsaken area. That's all you have. You have no job. Of course I can't give you a loan. So Brackage was desperate. He couldn't make his own films, couldn't work on film, couldn't support the kids. So he decided, as a kind of intimidation tactic, that he would speak loudly to the fellow and demand, and Brackage also had a booming voice. He could project extremely well. So in a big booming voice, this giant man starts to demand a loan from him. To no avail. He's told, there's no loan for you. And he leaves and he goes out walking and he passes a pawn shop. And he sees an 8mm camera and a little rewinds. Do you know the kind of rewinds they used? They'd be about this piece of wood with rewinds on them, maybe a foot wide, and the rewinds would be maybe 8 inches high, and a viewer built into this, and a splicer for splicing 8mm film. And it was $10, and he had it. So he went in and he bought this camera setup, this equipment, this camera and rewinds editing facility. And he came back and he made a little portrait of Jane, and he presented it to you. Jane, this is a song for you. That was how he was working in this time, making little songs that began really as love poems to Jane, to his friends, to the children, to the people around him. They became more and more complex over time, so that by the 23rd of them, 23rd Psalm branch, it was a feature-length film of absolutely extraordinary complexity, something you could never believe. A film in the Vietnam War invades the Brakhage household, the anger, feuding breaks out between them. Brakhage goes to visit Berlin, and he begins to see the parallels between the way people are moving, the actual body movements of people in America in this time and in Germany under Hitler. It's an extraordinary achievement. Okay, but it was the songs that Brakhage was teaching, and those works became absolutely central to my ideas of what the new electric poetry would be. I learned from Brakhage and from O'Grady that art isn't made really from out of a poet's relationship to the external world. Rather, the relationship to the circumambient world is mediated by several layers of mediation. In fact, that every work of art arises out of other works of art. Where does the idea for making a work of art come from? A work of art comes from a poet, a filmmaker, a painter, looking at other works of art and imaginatively engaging with them so that they can extend that work. Imagination is really a faculty. It doesn't begin from our relationship to an external world and a desire to imitate that external world. There is another kind of mimesis, of imitation that takes place. And this mimesis, this imitation, is really a kind of novel forming. A novel forming inspired by predecessor work. And in fact, I came to understand, partly through the writing of Northrop Frye in The Educated Imagination, partly through the writings of Harold Bloom, that in fact, the process of being chosen to make a work is a very peculiar one. I'm sorry, it would be wonderful if there were a way that a formula that I could give you to tell you how you can go about making a work of art. But in fact, it's far, far more mysterious than that. I don't know if any of you have watched the YouTube video of the great Canadian surrealist poet Leonard Cohen accepting an award from the Prince of Asturias. Have you seen this? It's worth it. And it's very much, by the way, a tribute to Lorca, to flamenco, to Spain, as the soil of Spain, as the nourishing his work. But at the end, he says, but all of this, and how all of this, and how one is inspired to make a poem still remains to me utterly mysterious. If I knew where to go to get poems, I'd visit it more often. I could go there regularly, but I don't know where that is, and every poem seems to be different. There's no formula. This is something that a view. I had heard Leonard say other things of the same sort earlier, but this is a lovely, really, it's worth going and looking at this YouTube video. I had heard Leonard say similar things before, and that was really a fundamental base for my teaching, that you couldn't possibly start out and propose a film and say, this is what I am going to do, and this is how I am going to make the film. This is what my film will be like, and when it's finished, this is what it will look like. Cohen talks about the way that he'd fumble and be confused and try and start a poem, and how often the efforts had to be thrown away, that it was just for the garbage. And you try and start again and keep a notebook and work at it and rework and rework and rework, till finally what came forth was not anything that he had thought that he had been elected to make. It was something far more mysterious. He's just a man in a suit, a conduit to a higher inspiration, and he has no idea when he will hear it, when he won't, when it's really the Holy Spirit, and when it's something else entirely, when it's sheer confusion and fumble. Okay, and so that too became a very fundamental basis for all of my teaching. So I left there with so the imagination is activated, if you will, when somehow you stumble across a work, and it is though that work elects you. It imposes the demand to do something. Sometimes the demand seems unclear and uncertain, but you know that you are required. You have been given a commission. The Commander-in-Chief has issued an order. You are to work on this. And your imagination is to, and it happens when you read a work. Cohen, extending this idea, talks about the day in which he went into a bookstore and saw a book and took it home. He had no idea what it was or what the importance was. It was a book by Federico Garcia Lorca, and he brought it home, and he was brought into a world of dogs hanging from trees and women crying in corridors and serpents and the like, the imagery, the common imagery of that he was drawn into this world, and that he says, I am so thankful that I never left it. The poet whose work elects you, if you will have an extremely important role in deciding what the value of your work might be. If you feel commanded by a work of routine, ordinary character, if you feel chosen by, I'm giving away prejudices, not everyone agrees with me. If you feel chosen by a poem by E.E. Cummings, you're not as likely to make strong work as if you have been chosen by a poem by Kenneth Rexroth or Robert Duncan or another great poet. And yes, you can be elected multiple times. Ginsberg felt elected first by Blake, whose voice he heard in a vision. And then by Walt Whitman, and then by poets such as Christopher Smart, who you probably don't know, a wonderful, mad poet. Jubilate Agno is just such a wild, crazy, crackpot, ecstatic, wondrous poem. And by Plotinus. And by Edgar Allan Poe, who is a poet of extraordinary interest. Okay, so there was I left through various exchanges that we had at that first occasion, a sense of art as growing out of artworks, as growing out of other artworks, and they are really imaginative transformations of other artworks. I wonder if it would be appropriate at this point to see part 3 of Dog Star Man, the so-called Meat Jewel section. Okay, there are qualities in part 4 that are similar to Eros and Wonder 2, but if some of you attend at Resurrectus Est screening sometime this week, on Saturday you'll see other ways that work of mine draws on work by Brakhage. Okay, now to come to so I took away from that workshop the idea that art is made from art, that a process of election, to be a work gives one a command to attempt to produce. It can be bungled, it can be done badly, but that the imagination of the artist is reworking predecessor work. There are ways in which it was my intimate acquaintance with this part 3 of Dog Star Man that gave me ideas about what kind of imagery I could make for that film. And this, if I can sermonize a little bit, I was a teacher for many, many years and considered it one of my jobs to try and offer help and assistance and instruction to students. And if there's one real piece of instruction that I'd like to pass on to you today, it would be the importance of going and to read as much poetry as you can, to go to galleries regularly and look at new work, to look at old work, to think about it, to steep yourself in it, to go to film screenings, to go to experimental film screenings, to go to musical performances, to go to dance works, to go to theater. It's your basic job. That's where the ideas for your work, if it's to be original, will come from. It's funny to say that you rely on other work to make work that is something very new and original, but the imperative becomes to transform. And the imagination, what we see at work in any maker's work, is the imagination of one artist transforming the work of a predecessor that has chosen him. It really is as simple as that. When I'm trying to, I think the clearest route of access to the image quality of Eros and Wonder is to know that I know Brackage's Dog Star Man, and in particular, part 3 of Dog Star Man very well. There are other things I could talk about, and that is the poem and its relationship to surrealism and to Leonard Cohen, and you could know how I was transforming Leonard Cohen, who himself is transforming. It's his imagination at work transforming, that every work is a work of art. It's about the artist's transforming a predecessor's work, that the work is really about. It's not about the circumambient world. It's about a relationship with a predecessor, and frankly, a wrestle with the predecessor. Because, of course, there is something that is really, really terrifying in feeling oneself to be commanded by the work of a great, strong predecessor. Is there anything? I am constantly haunted by the question, is there anything that I can do that Brackage didn't do before me and do better? That becomes the feeling that haunts every artist that is work. Is there anything that I can do, if I'm working in my other modes, is there anything that I can do that wasn't already done by the poet Kenneth Rexroth and done better? Am I just a secondary, derivative, insignificant artist? It's the terror that haunts every artist. You know how deeply connected depression and art making are, and I think that's really the basis of it. am I really worthy to try and extend this work by Brakhage? And by the way, it haunted me for many years. And then, of course, over time, something wonderful happened, and that was Brakhage began to see my work and began to draw some of his ideas from my films. In fact, in the way that the experimental film world is often very mean and crabby and rotten, and the ideas on the relationship of nature and artwork that I began to develop in the 80s before this. And what I'm saying, I'm not suggesting that the artwork imitates the appearance of the external world. That's something I just reject. But rather that there is also a way of being drawing on a kind of creative process that flows through all of reality and getting in touch with this fundamental creativity of reality. This became a topic that really interested me from the time of Constellations on in the late 80s, and and my belief that the forms of many works of art draw on a creative process that runs through all of nature and shapes natural appearances. So you're going behind the appearances to this underlying creativity. I began writing on that in the 80s. It was inspired by work that I had been doing. And also my thinking about romanticism and the arts and so on, relating to other writing that I was doing. And it influenced how I filmed Mesa Verde, other parts of Constellations. Brakhage saw my work on Mesa Verde and also on Stonehenge, and that became another factor. And he then one day, a total rotter calls me on the telephone, and he says, "You know what? Stan Brakhage is stealing your ideas now. He's plagiarizing from you." So my response to that was, well, bless him. I have stolen so much from him. If he's taken something from me, thank God I've returned in a little measure what I have taken from him. But why I told this story is, yes, it became kind of a dialogue of he was drawing on my work and his Visions in Meditation series, and just as I had been drawing on his work. Okay, now I also left with the notion from McLuhan of the plasticity of consciousness, that consciousness does not remain the same through all of history, that consciousness has a history, that it undergoes change and transformation, that its basic forms change throughout history. And McLuhan's ideas on the plasticity of consciousness, which he began seeing a new kind of consciousness emerging in the poetry of Ezra Pound and so on, and then began seeing reflected in popular culture. But the consciousness undergoes change. It is plastic. It is transformed over time. But there is, he believed, a basic pattern to these changes. That it involves, that the history of consciousness involves a series of corsi and ricorsi. That means, following a path and then turning back. This idea he drew from, and it was an idea also held by Northrop Frye, and in fact characterizes the work of a group of communications theorists in Toronto, Ontario, centered at the University of Toronto. Marshall McLuhan, Northrop Frye, a person who taught at U of T for a period of time and then went down to Princeton, Eric Havelock, and Harley Parker, who was a designer who worked at the museum, at the Royal Ontario Museum, a kind of archaeological museum for the most part. There's a pattern that consciousness's nature is shaped by language, and language forms change. It begins with a kind of, the originary language is probably gestural and participatory and mimetic. I want to tell something, and you begin communication through bodily gestures that are dynamic, and they lead to a feeling of participating in the reality that you are imitating through your gestures. Out of this gestural language, there develops poetic language. Poetic language is still very much attached to the body. It involves a feeling, it is based on rhythm. It is fundamentally rhythmic, gestural, tied to the body rather, and dynamic. It is plurissemic. Every poetic image has a whole variety of meanings. You can say the image means this, and it means this, and it means this, and it means this, without contradiction. Okay, then language becomes more abstract, detached from the body, shaped into logical forms. For Giambattista Vico, the bogeyman of recent developments was René Descartes. And consciousness is isolated. Up to that point, poetic language is still very largely participatory. When I read, and I'll come to this later, I'll come back to it if I get the chance. But here's a little bit of Ezra Pound. Ed ascoltando a legge mormorio, listening to the light murmur. There came a new subtlety of eyes into my tent, whether of spirit or hypostasis, but what the blindfold hides, or at carnival, nor any pair showed anger. It's complex, multifaceted, many meanings, and the rhythms seem to participate in the feelings that he is conveying. It's still participatory language, but then discursive language develops. It's logical. Consciousness is isolated from reality. It becomes more and more a language of administration and becomes increasingly a destructive force. In fact, as it develops more and more, and we are more and more detached from reality and in trying to administer reality and trying to administer each other and thinking in rational, logical terms, not how our bodies participate together, in thinking about rational, logical terms, we become so isolated from one another, so unaware of each other's needs, we can no longer be good to each other. Remind you of some parts of the poem in this. So language becomes increasingly corroded, weakened by this. The language loses its richness, its wonder. It becomes crude, brutal. Watch Donald Trump anytime that he speaks. Crude, brutal, barbaric language. And that's the next stage. This is the collapse. We collapse into barbarism again. And then, hopefully, the cycle will begin again, and gestural language will develop, and then poetic language, and then, unfortunately, abstract language will develop, and barbarism will develop again. But that's the cycle of history. Do any of you know of I'm sure you will not have read it because it's so embedded in the English language. But do any of you know a great novel that was rooted in the work of Giambattista Vico? Finnegan's Wake. And some of you have probably heard that begins in mid-sentence and then goes through. And there are a whole series that actually goes through some of the phases of this cycle of history and history begins again. It circles back on itself. This corso and ricorso, this cycle is closed as the end of the book closes back into the beginning. Okay. So, an idea of the plasticity of consciousness. One of the peculiarities of the Toronto School of Communications, which was rooted in these ideas of Giambattista Vico, was the hope, likely a vain hope, that they were convinced that abstract language had collapsed. Literate language was at an end. Abstract language also becomes the language of the book and reading. And some of you may know McLuhan's ideas on reading and visuality and linear thinking and so on. That's because the language is abstract and it is something that we can capture. The phonetic alphabet also assists in this, and we can embed it in a book. Well, this abstract language had collapsed, and some members of the Toronto School of Communications at times seemed to hope that we would skip the period of barbarism and go directly into the stage of orality, the poetic language. Marshall McLuhan had sometimes thought that, no, we're going through a page, an era of barbarism, and he used to be very dark about it at times. War and Peace in the Global Village, and the Global Village is going to be, which is what follows from the collapse of abstract language. We enter the Global Village, and it's going to be war. That it's characterized by conflict. He also speaks of the new speech of youth and is absolutely corrosive about it. If any of you have heard students grunting in classes and their wretched, minimal vocabularies, you can't deny that we have entered a phase of barbarism again. That was one aspect of it. At other times, he really seemed to celebrate the development of oral poetry, orality, as the way of revitalizing the poetic language. Northrop Frye was a very shy man. And he looked like a man whose greatest delight in life would be going home in the evening and adding up a column of figures. He looked more like a good gray accountant than anybody you could imagine. Until you asked him a question about poetry. And it was absolutely incredible. He could talk, and he loved the wild, wild poets, the strange, the weird poets, the oral poets. But also he loved one time a student interviewer went over to his office and said, "Now, don't you think it's absurd that people are calling Bob Dylan a poet? Bob Dylan's no poet, don't you agree?" On the contrary, I think Bob Dylan is a poet, and in fact, a very good poet. You know, poetry was dying on the page. Poetry has been dying. And what will revitalize poetry, what will bring back poetry, are the singers who are singing poetry. This is the new oral poetry. Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, and it goes on. Also, interestingly, so much of it's something I missed for decades and decades, a realization that I only came to very, very recently, and partly by reason of that series on country music recently. Country music, the lyrics in country music are so often just extraordinary oral poetry. This is the great poetry of large parts of the United States. Forget all this abstract stuff in books that they are all but indecipherable. This vital oral poetry is the future. And this became also something that I took away from this class and became very interested in my idea of creating an electric poetry was to create a kind of oral poetry. This is an oral experience. Okay? Now, what are the questions? What are the features of oral poetry? Before I get to that, I want to just mention a few other influences on me. And that was Kenneth Rexroth, a poet who is almost universally ignored, and I think is one of America's greatest poets. and a man who had influence throughout the San Francisco poetry scene, which was so vital and incredible how this small town could produce so much great poetry, the Berkeley Renaissance, for years I had invited Kenneth Rexroth to the university where I studied, and I considered it a great, it was one of the great early experiences of my life. And I began to celebrate his work. And all the people that I knew that liked advanced poetry just discounted him, thought I was foolish for this. And after a little while, I stopped talking about him. I continued to read, but it just seemed pointless to try and convince people. Then one day I was talking to Stan Brakhage, and I thought, well, we talk about poetry all the time. It would be dishonest of me not to allow how highly I think of Kenneth Rexroth. It would just be dishonest of me. It's like, having a secret love that I wouldn't ever tell people about, almost as though I were ashamed of it. So I told Brakhage, Rexroth is absolutely a great poet. I went to his salons when I lived in San Francisco. He influenced Robert Duncan, he influenced Jack Spicer, he influenced me, and he influenced Sophie's Place, Lawrence Jordan, enormously. Both Lawrence Jordan and Stan Brakhage attended Kenneth Rexroth's salons. First of all, Kenneth Rexroth is a deeply spiritual poet. A poet who spent years sitting in Buddhist meditation in Japan. He followed a version of Huayan Buddhism from China. He couldn't go to China at the time. He studied and he sat in Japan, but it had been taken to Japan under the name Kigon Buddhism. It's a kind of tantric Buddhism. It's the Buddhism that was embedded in the great, wonderful experimental film Quick Billy. And there are so few people who were... Bruce Bailey lived in San Francisco and was associated with a number of people in Kenneth Rexroth's circle. I don't know whether he knew Rexroth, but I know that the drawings and charts that he made for that film were directly correspond so closely to the meditation practices that Kenneth Rexroth engaged in. So he was a Buddhist. He was an Anglo-Catholic. He would also go to Anglo-Catholic monasteries, one of them just outside of New York City. They're deeply spiritual. They are also works that he sees poetry as direct communication of one completed individual to the heart of another. When you are composing poetry, you are composing to speak to the depths, the heart. You are speaking as a completed human being to the depths of another person, striving to be a completed person. Writing poetry is a sacramental act. So that was another influence on me. And I think you can see aspects of it in Eros and Wonder. Ginsberg and the Beats and the Berkeley Renaissance Again, when I was a student, I invited Allen Ginsberg to my university and hosted him and did all that sort of thing, and was aware of Ginsberg as essentially an oral poetry whose work depends on another member of the Toronto School is a Jesuit by the name of Walter Ong. He taught, I think he still does teach in St. Louis. St. Louis or St. Louis? Anyway, he teaches at either St. Louis or St. Louis, whichever is the correct pronunciation, and uses the term speech force. Strange now to think of you gone without corsets and eyes while I walk on the sunny pavement of Greenwich Village. And I've been up all night talking, reading Kaddish aloud, listening to Ray Charles' Blues Shout Blind on the phonograph, the rhythm, and your memory in my head 3 years after, and read Adonias' last triumph stanzas aloud, wept, realizing how we suffer, and how death is that remedy all singers dream of, sing, remember, prophesy, as in the Hebrew anthem or the Buddhist Book of Answers, and my own imagination, a withered leaf at dawn. Boom, boom, boom. One forceful verbal ejaculation after another. This is what speech force is. This is the form that's assumed by oral poetry, and what that and so it has. And out of that, it comes to be engaged with energy and spontaneity. It's almost spontaneous creation. You all know Howell, I presume, and have read Howell, which he composed, almost at white heat. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and rags and tatters and sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating over the tops of cities, contemplating jazz, etc. And it's a way, it's literally, I did the breath thing purposely because it's actually a way of language controlling breath and dividing up the poem on breath units. And then the long line developing out of that breath and into the next. And what happens when you control breathing that way? It's yogic. It transforms consciousness. It engenders ecstasy. It's a transformation of consciousness. But of course, this spontaneous creation that is involved with breath and breath control is also one of the features of jazz. And so it's a kind of jazz prosody that develops in this. And another important connection, this regulating consciousness has the breath has the effect of transforming consciousness. What does it do? It develops, it liberates something that another of the great experimental filmmakers and influences on Stan Brakhage and influences on me had. It develops, it engenders the old brain. A term from Len Lai, who I think is a major film theorist and is just everywhere ignored. I've never seen anyone taking up Len Lai's film theory. Len Lai developed a theory of film that film is based like many other arts forms. When I was talking of basic forms that shape creativity, that shapes reality, Len Lai thought that the old brain was tapped into these universal forces that animated all of reality. And so a wand spinning in the wind and producing was revealing basic natural processes. But it was the old brain that was not abstract. Remember, we're back in these ideas of Vico and his animosity, his ideas on abstract language. Gets in touch with the old brain really loves movement and dynamism. So everywhere we can see in painting gestures developing, and they are universal and have universal human meaning. The dancers compose movements. And what they do, we participate kinesthetically when we watch a dancer moving. We feel the movements in us, and that releases the activity of our old brain that taps into very universal forces. Okay, so then this idea of the old brain, and I'm going to have to end with this, a final influence on Brakhage, the theorist that Brakhage most often cited in meditations on vision, was the poet Charles Olson, who was really, in my view, the major theorist of the beats. And for him, again, we have to get beyond propositional logic. How do we do that? We do that by training ourselves to open ourselves to all of the circumambient field of energy. Energy impacts on us. There are these energies that we feel impacting on us. They register in us, and then we outer those energies in composition. A composition is a projection of energies from where the poet got it right over to you, the reader. And to do so, the form has to be dynamic. And this offers a way of getting back to rudimentary types of experience, awareness. By the way, Olson also connected this abstract language with phonetic language, alphabets. It was the alphabet that begins to produce sentences in the subject-predicate structure, and so involves propositional logic, subject-predicate logic. How would we get beyond it? To turn to languages that are glyphs. Chinese language, many of Olson's followers turn to. For Olson to try and discover, to try and refresh language and get back to the primals. He took a trip to Mexico to spend time studying the stelae and architecture of Yucatan, believing that there was, that among the Mayans, there was a kind of consciousness that had not been affected by subject-predicate logic, and so was involved in that old participatory forms of awareness. Olson influenced me enormously, and I also I retraced his trip in a long film that I did in the mid-1980s called Lamentations, a Monument to the Dead World. Okay, I think I have to end up now. Isn't that right? I have lots more I would like to be able to say to you, but I hope I've given you a little something. Thank you very much.
No tendremos tiempo para si par quieren hacer preguntas, también lo vamos a tener en la biblioteca toda la semana y como podrán ver es un caudal sin fin de cosas que aprender y que ver. Entonces, si alguien tiene un par de preguntas.
Pásale el micrófono, por favor.
Yes.
En inglés. Oh, obvio.
I just want to say I have the word to say that you're great and what you express is so great, and I wanted to ask you what is the exact feeling you wanted to express when you make a film?
What is the feeling I want to express? It's not something that I don't start out with any sense of a feeling that I want to convey. In fact, I think that it's absolutely necessary. This is going to seem very strange. There aren't very many people that I know that agree with me. I think you have to conceal from yourself what it is that you are thinking about. If I ever want, this is also in some ways an embarrassingly personal film. Do you think I would have the courage to tell myself I'm going to make an embarrassingly personal film like this? Not on your life. I might be relatively radical. I might think that I'm relatively liberated or whatever, but I wouldn't want to know what it was that I was setting out to do. And in fact, I think it's always necessary to conceal what it is that you are working on. I find it really amusing to think of how artists don't like to talk about their work while they're making it. I can tell you the one little anecdote on that. I'm sure most of you think of Michael Snow as a very, very cerebral filmmaker, and talking about his work with him after it's done, it's a daunting experience. Mike is a very, very brilliant man. His ideas are really rich and complex and challenging, and he thinks every issue right to fundamentals. He's a real philosopher in film. But while he's making it, one time he had run out of money making a film, and I happened to have an editing table, a flatbed, kind of like a Steenbeck, and I also had an assistant working with me. And he didn't have the wherewithal to rent equipment. It had gone, I'm telling you, life as an experimental filmmaker is tough. I mean it. So he asked me if he could borrow my equipment and use it. Oh, of course, sure, Michael. So he showed up at the door we agreed to come over this day, and he showed up at the door of my apartment where I kept my flatbed, and he knocked, and it was funny. And then he hid so that when I opened the door, I couldn't see him. But then he always plays little games like that. And he came in, and I said to him, Michael, what are you working on? What are you going to do? The look of terror over his face. You don't talk about work while you're making it. It has to be in some other part of the brain. It can't be in the part that's analytical, the part that's discussing ideas, rather in the way that I'm discussing. It has to be below that, okay? And so he didn't want to talk about it. I said, oh, I know that look and I know that feeling. I'll just go to my study. You use the flatbed. I'll be in my study. I won't have an idea what you're doing. Okay, so I think we have to deceive ourselves because the thinking has to go on in some other part of the brain, in the old brain that Len Lai talks about. I often manage to disguise to myself what I am doing by telling myself that what I'm working on is a sheer technical challenge. In this case, it was sound processing and ways to turn speech sound and music into noise, that this would be a technical challenge, and hand processing and image processing. And that's all that I'm doing in this film. I'm just working on a technical problem. And then as it goes on, I mean, I'm not a complete fool. As time goes by, I realized that the old brain was telling me to do other things, and I was obeying. But I really do work thinking that all that I'm doing is taking on a technical challenge. My new technical challenge is to create a digital cinema that really is about interacting electrical fields. And I tell myself that's the technical challenge that I'm engaged in. I have no doubt that as it goes on, I learn there are other things that I'm doing, but I have to deceive myself. Otherwise, I would be scared into withdrawing the work. What the old brain does is really trying to connect one with vibratory energies. And so, Eros and Wonder begins in one kind of vibration that's dark and gray and gloomy, and emerges and becomes very much a feeling of affliction and misery and plague and so on. And then the vibratory energies try to raise one to something, into another state, as objects disappear. The eyes roll inward and we begin to commune with inner vibrations. Okay?
No, you answered my question speaking there, but thank you for enlightening us with your words and your cinema.
Oh, thank you very much.
I just have a question that if you move from a technical problem and that's the way you sort of work day to day, how do you go about saying, I'm done with this film, this is a complete, I see the complete idea, whatever that is? How do you write a sort of a structure, a screenplay, anything like that?
No. I keep struggling till I come to a sense that all of the energies have resolved themselves into a whole. And that if I try and do anything more, I'm just going to be repeating myself pointlessly.
It would be pointless to say that Bruce is a great filmmaker, so thanks to the CCC for letting us bring him here. And many, many, many thanks to Bruce for coming and to enlighten us all with his words. It really means a lot to a lot of us. So I ask for an applause.
How can we gain access and see your film?
That's a difficult question right now. They used to be shown all the time on 16 millimeter. That dried up, of course, you know that. So I've been working, doing scans, and it's taken much, much longer than I ever imagined. This is one of them. Trying to create digital masters, and then I hope to have a Blu-ray sometime soon.
Thank you very much for your time, generosity. Thank you for lessons on wrestling, poetry, and transformation. Thank you very much.